officially welcome. This session is about uncovering or unpacking FOIA in Delaware. And I'm Rebecca Snyder with the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association. We're delighted to host the session in collaboration with the Delaware Journalism Collaborative. That's a lot of collabs. And our panelists today are John Flaherty and Phil Freedman. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a second. And what we're doing today is really talking about what FOIA is, how you can use it in your reporting, what the process is in terms of crafting your request and getting it heard, and then potential changes that might be happening to the law. December 6th, we'll have a follow-up session, as Crystal mentioned, what you do when you're denied, and we'll have an attorney from Ballard Spahr speaking with us, as well as a few journalists to kind of talk about what they do. We've got a lot of wisdom in the room. I'm really excited about the reporters who have come out. So please feel free to jump in if you have something to add to any of the points that we've had here. We will be in good shape and learn from each other. So with that, now that we have our ground rules and our plan, John, you want to introduce yourself first, and then we'll go with Phil?
That's it. Sounds good, Rebecca. Before I introduce myself, I want to thank you, Rebecca, and your assistant, Samantha, for all your work in putting together this panel discussion, first of two. So you guys really do a really good job there, and thank you very much. My name is John Flaherty, and I am not a journalist. I was a nonprofit lobbyist for about 20 years in Dover. So I worked on a lot of FOIA issues as a lobbyist in the General Assembly. And so my approach is probably going to be different than most of you working journalists out there. I am a 15-year board member for the Delaware Coalition for Open Government, and I was a lobbyist for their Dover 9 years. And prior to that, I was a lobbyist for Common Cause of Delaware for about 12 years. So I worked with FOIA from a legislative standpoint and also from, I guess, an activist standpoint. And I'll share with you what I do and how I do it. And there's really no one way to do this, but everybody can pick up on tips and maybe make a bigger whole from that. So that's it.
Perfect. All right, Phil, tell us about you.
Well, I'd like to thank Rebecca and everybody for putting this together too. We can't talk more about FOIA, especially in Delaware. Also, everybody who doesn't know it, John is the person who I tell reporters to call when we want a comment about how ridiculous things are in Delaware. So he's our go-to expert for that. I am a news director of Delaware Online and the News Journal. I have some other investigative editing duties with Gannett, and I'm the point person here for our FOIA strategies and how we attack denials and things like that.
Great. All right. And so just to kind of set the stage, we talk about, and Katie brought it up in her introduction, that, she's familiar with Maryland's PIA, and then there's FOIA. So just to kind of set the stage, there, of course, is a federal FOIA law, which governs federal documents, but then each state and sometimes there's different flavors as you go deeper into smaller municipalities and public bodies. But every state has its own public records law. So in Delaware, it's also called FOIA. In Maryland, it's called the Public Information Act. In other states, it may be termed as different things. And generally, I first want to talk about what is and what is not a public record, because I think traditionally people think, oh, well, it's a piece of paper, or it's an electronic record, but if you both could tell us, Phil and John, what do you consider a public record? At its baseline, it's anything that is developed by a public body in the transaction of its business. But does that include things like voicemails, emails, text messages? How does what's the extent of public records?
Good, John.
Well, Rebecca,
right, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, it's always good to have a copy of the FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act law, so you can see and itemize. There are 19 exemptions to the public records law here in the state of Delaware. And they define public record as information of any kind: owned, made, used, retained, received, produced, composed, drafted, or otherwise compiled or collected by any public body. So the next question is, what's a public body? Well, I would say that anybody who receives state assistance is a public body. But as you all probably know, when you try to get information from the University of Delaware, for example, they are not a public body. Only the Board of Trustees is a public body. The subcommittees of the board are not public bodies, so it gets a little confusing. So it's really in the eyes of the beholder. Even though the University of Delaware gets about over $100 million a year, they are not considered a public body under FOIA, so their records are exempt from disclosure to me and many other people.
Yeah.
You can get a copy of the FOIA law if you're in the legislative hall. If you go in the basement, they have a bill preparation room there. They do have copies of that law and a few other laws that they'll give out for free. But if you go on the General Assembly website, the legislative information site, you can download the appropriate section of the law, which is, I think, FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, is Title 29, Section 10,001. So you can get a copy of the law and read it. But I think the important point is that when you're looking for records, under FOIA, a public body carries the burden of proof. You don't have to tell them why you want this or justify why you need this. They have the burden of telling you why you cannot get that particular record. And I think that's important because a lot of people underestimate their ability to obtain information. And I think that's important. You don't have to be an expert on FOIA. You just need to get a copy of what you want. And that submission can be made. And it's up to the body, the public body, to either grant that in whole or in part, or to deny that.
Right. So what I'm getting from that, and Phil, I want to go to you in just a second on the nuances of public records, is a public record is anything that is created in the transaction of the public body's business. And you don't have to be an expert necessarily on what you need. You just need to make sure you're asking for it. So
I would say, Rebecca, the way I look at what should be available, what a public record is if public taxpayers had any part of it, that it should be public unless there's John cites University of Delaware. We've been fighting over that for a couple of decades here. But that entails any government action, because the government's paid for by taxpayers, any emails between government officials and members of the public or between themselves. Like the problem in Delaware is, what I think is a public record and what John thinks might not be perfectly the same. And what different people think is in Delaware, it's irrelevant because there's so many exemptions written into it that things that you would think, well, why isn't this public? Why can't we get this? Is because somebody, the legislature made an exemption for it. The other problem we have is, John talks about you don't have to be an expert. I think at some point you sort of need to be an expert. So when you ask, you're not asking for things you have no shot at, or that you know how to fashion your FOIA request to get a response or be able to talk to a FOIA coordinator. The problem in Delaware is the FOIA coordinators themselves don't know what the law says, and you have to play games. And we've suspected, and I know this is being recorded, but we suspected that once newspapers started to show some financial strain in the last 10 or 15 years in Delaware, we got a very strong sense, and this isn't recently as much, but I would say maybe 8 or 10 years ago, that every FOIA request we put in would get denied under what we suspected was, well, let's just deny it. And then they have to decide whether they want to spend more money to chase us, and they'll be, and hope they go away. And what we've done is, yes, we don't have tens of thousands of dollars to to hire lawyers to fight every FOIA denial, but we know we're educated on what we're supposed to have and ways to get to it. And we've talked to the Attorney General's office a lot, and the current Attorney General is at least more responsive than previous ones have been. And I'm not saying it's great or anything, but the key is knowing the law, knowing what you can get, knowing how you can get through the morass of apathy or whatever to get it, and just staying with it. Like a lot of times we'll FOIA things just because we're fishing or we suspect something. Other times people tell us something exists. So, we know it's there and we want to get it. So being able to
Yeah, and I think knowing a little bit about what you're going after, that gets into the crafting of the response or the crafting of the request. So when you these are a lot of great answers on like how you shake that information loose. But if we can step back for a second to talk about how do you use public records in your reporting? So why should people care? There's a lot of ways reporters want to use public records. They are amazing primary sources. Xerxes Wilson, who was called away on a reporting job just before our session, talked about it yesterday in our confab call, is like keeping public officials honest, because you can really check, you can do the homework on what they're saying. But I'm interested from both of you, and Phil, let's start with you, on how you use public records and how reporters can integrate them into their stories.
Well, it depends on the story. I mean, if it's a health, we use public records. We'll just publish databases of like everybody who works for the state, how much they make, what their job is. But also if we're on an enterprise story, or I think Amanda Fries might be on here. She's working on a story now. You've seen some of the lead water testing. A lot of that reporting involved getting emails among health department, school department of education people, and what they've said to each other. When you talk to a public official and they tell you this is why they do something, and then you FOIA email communications that show something else, that's what our job is. That is how we shine a light on what's really happening in government, and not just reporting what the public relations and public information officers want the public to know. So.
And I do feel like increasingly in the industry, the public information officer or the spokesperson is just saying the party line, like very Teflon package statements. And public information is a way to get behind those statements and really find out what's going on. So it allows you to kind of really do the research that you need. So John, from an activist perspective, how are you using public records, and what does that mean for you?
Rebecca, I use public records to try to buttress an argument, to try to gain support. And let me give you a specific example. I ride transportation a lot, DART, and about 6 years ago, all the bus stops, not all the bus stops, about 80% of the bus stops were taken out of the main square in Wilmington, Delaware, Rodney Square. Now, when I first heard about this, I found it, I just didn't believe that the governor of the state of Delaware, Governor Carney, would order this, and he did. And I just found that incredible. So I made a FOIA request to the governor's office, and also an email request to DelDOT to get any and all email about this removal of bus stops in Rodney Square. Now, DelDOT responded. They had these emails, but they wanted to charge me $800. Now, the governor's office, to their credit, they did respond, but it took 6 months to fulfill the request. So you have to be patient. So I made the request in early December. I got the emails in May of 2018. But of the 200 pages of emails, I got 100 pages of emails regarding removing bus stops in Rodney Square. But I got 100 pages of completely blacked out redactions. And the governor declared that he had executive privilege to redact 100 pages of the 200 that they sent me. And I felt I never felt that executive privilege should apply to moving a bus stop, but evidently it did. So even though I disagree with his redactions, they didn't charge me anything. And that was a big part of it too. I don't have $800 to spread about to different agencies. So I was able to take those emails and use that to buttress an argument for gaining public support for getting transit back in the central business district of Wilmington. But the emails were really, really important, because I think with the emails, you really get a lot of personal reflections and reasonings that you don't get in say, letters or other types of communications. So in one sense, I was disappointed in the fee, but also I was glad that the governor didn't charge me anything, even though he redacted half the emails that I got.
Right. So let's spend a little bit of time on those barriers to FOIA requests. We'll talk in our December session about what to do when you are denied. But custodians have, I feel like, a whole quiver full of arrows to shoot down your request, from the money that you talked about, John, saying, like this request will cost X amount of dollars, to drawing things out because, if you miss the news cycle, your story's kind of gone. So drawing out the time, sometimes litigation, and then overuse of exemptions. So are there ways that, Phil, you have found in sort of crafting, or how do you break through some of those initial barriers with custodians?
So the two answers. One is, sometimes we get quoted exorbitant costs, and sometimes we get denied. So real quick, when we get quoted exorbitant costs, the first thing we try to do is work with the FOIA coordinator, which isn't always easy, because sometimes they don't want to work with you, or they won't communicate, or it takes a while. But in working with them, sometimes with the better ones, and I say better, not good ones, and everybody will understand that difference. You can say, well, here's what I'm looking for, and these are the keywords or the search terms or whatever. And why is it so much? Well, it's so much because this one person has 10 million. Maybe, you can sort of recraft your request to reduce the cost. Or you can say, all right, well, they quoted me $3,600 for this response. I want emails between 6 people. I'll start with 2. How much would that be? And then maybe if those 2 show something, we'll do it. So a lot of it is that. As far as denials, again, that's why you really need to know what you can get, what FOIA law and the exemptions say you can get. And if you ask for something that you can't get, you got to think of another way to do it sometimes, or maybe another agency. Sometimes if it's when you're dealing with Delaware officials and people outside the state, it's better to go to that state and try to FOIA that end of it. But denials is about knowing the law. And if you think you've been unjustly denied, the first thing we do, and I know this is December's topic, but maybe somebody won't be here, but
you can foreshadow.
Yeah, the first thing you do is say, I think your denial is wrong. You cited this exemption and denial. That's not what I'm asking for. That's not what the law says. And if you get shot down again, like, don't hesitate to go to the Attorney General's office. I would say we used to be more sparingly in doing that, because we didn't want to be like the PIAs that were always going there and whining to mom or dad that we're not helping. But at this point, a lot of the reporters in our room who use FOIA frequently, and me and the other editors here, we know what we can and can't get, and we know when we're getting worked or played, and we won't hesitate to go to the Attorney General and say, like, we know this isn't right, and get them to intervene. Now, we don't always win them, but we have fair success at that. I think a lot of FOIA requests, even in our room, are rejected because we're asking for something that's specifically there's an exemption for. Now, the one thing to remember with exemptions, and we use this a lot, is those exemptions don't say it is illegal to provide this information to the public. It just gives them an out that they don't have to. And we'll sometimes try to work with the court and say, this is what we're going after. If you're worried about releasing it because you think we're going to use people's names or addresses, we don't want that. We don't care about that. All we want is this information. Sometimes you can work through it. So the problem in the state is, I would say that FOIA coordinators as a group are not great. You think their job is to do that and they should be working. And, you know, we've had a couple of meetings with the Attorney General and things, and I've tried to say, you know, what would really help is if the highest law enforcement or legal person in the state said, you know, the arbiter of FOIA said to all the FOIA coordinators, hey, this isn't newsflash. Freedom of information, that our perspective should be, we want to give the public as much of the information that they have a right to as possible, but I think their jobs are sort of set up and framed as, your job is to make sure nothing gets out, you know, that,
Right.
and the Attorney General in New York State did that, and we've been trying to press Kathy Jennings to do that here, and she sort of smiles back nicely at me when I ask her that. But
Well, and it is a cultural shift, and we see that in other states as well. Like, you know, I think there's a culture of protectiveness around this information, as opposed to that paradigm shift of saying this is the public's information and certain things are exempt because of privacy, personnel, HIPAA rules. You know,
Right.
so there's a variety of reasons, but there's a lot of discretionary exemptions. And so I wanted just also to bring up, Katie had a question earlier that Phil, you graciously answered in the chat, but the role of suing someone if they don't comply with the FOIA request. And Phil, you had mentioned that you tend to use more in-house strategies, or maybe a letter from an attorney before it gets to a lawsuit process. Could you just articulate that a little bit more clearly for the recording?
yeah, like I said, I mean, sometimes reporters will send a FOIA and it'll get denied, and then they'll send me the communication, and I might say, all right, well, let's try this, and I think they denied it because of this, and this thing isn't really what you're going after, and that can solve the majority of those. I would say that the biggest hindrance we have now is they'll just charge, like John referenced with the Rodney Square bus situation, like an inordinate amount of money. And when you think about the bureaucracy and that these agencies all have FOIA coordinators and people who are assembling all this like the information's there, it's in a computer. It's getting somebody in IT to do a search and prepare it. We're not, and you know, you get estimates of, you know, thousands of dollars for things, and it like, our argument as journalists is, wait a second, taxpayers, this isn't like I pay your salary thing, but taxpayers are funding the government. They're funding the organization of the government. They're funding the collection of this data and the people who were assigned to do it. And now on top of that, you're going to pay me extra to access it. Like, who are you doing all this for? You know,
Right.
like it's there. And, you know, there's so many bizarre exemptions in Delaware law, and we could have panel every month for 100 years and not get to all of them. But a lot of them were specifically instigated because somebody who knew somebody in the legislature or somebody in the legislature had a bad experience where a reporter or somebody in the public got something, and it's like, all right, well, let's write a law so they can't do that again, you know. And
Right. And we see those retaliatory laws come up in other states as well. So both of you have talked about how to craft a request that gets results. And so I wanted to shift our conversation to that process part and sort of knowing how we get to how reporters get to a request that makes things happen. You know, I've heard from some people that they prefer to make a phone call first to see, you know, can you just give the information as opposed to going through a FOIA request. Could you talk about what process, like nuts and bolts, what works for you and how you define and narrow your request to get results?
Me,
You
I'll
wanna-
go.
Go,
Um,
Phil.
so I'll tell a quick little story about that. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we had two really good investigative reporters in our room, and one of them relied a lot on FOIA requests and getting a lot of public documents, and she filed a ton of FOIA requests. The other one, I don't think ever filed a FOIA request, right? And she would get information by working sources. They're both great reporters, just two different approaches. But the second reporter was like, I don't want to wait. By the time I can, like John says, you wait 6 months for a FOIA response. Then, I mean, they have 15 days to say whether they're going to fill it, but then they can take 100 years if they want to actually fill it. And so the other reporter was like, I'm just going to, I work sources. I have a good network. I know my sources really well. They know who I am and how I'll treat their information and their identity and all that stuff. And they were both equally successful, I think. The second reporter would get people to send her emails. And so, when we do a FOIA request, it's sort of like we get a tip and we're doing a fishing expedition. You still have to go through, reams and reams of it. If you work your sources really well and you can convince a source like, look, you work for the people, you work in the government, this is wrong. How can you get me this key email that shows what happened, or this key document that shows what happened, without putting yourself at risk or anything like that? So there's two ways of getting information. And in Delaware, our approach is, we know FOIA rules stink. We know the coordinators aren't responsive. We know their mindset isn't, oh, my job is to help people get what they want. If they ask for the wrong thing or something they can't get, I'm going to help them. They don't do that. They just say, nope, try again. So having strategies to get around it and working sources. And I would say, of all the investigations we've done, and since I've been here, it's at worst 50-50 how many involve FOIA responses to ones that we didn't even go through that, depending on what it, and we could have gotten the information that way. But I would tell you, don't use FOIA as a crutch. It's something, if you know something's there and you think you can get it, obviously figure out a way to get it. But just be prepared. You might have to work back channels and get people to send you things. Again, I mean, like, it is illegal for government workers to certain documents to give to you, right? But it's not illegal for us to receive them. Now, the gray area is, we can't say to somebody, hey, go into your boss's office and go, jimmy the lock on his desk, or figure out how to open his safe and get the stuff. But we can say, look, impress on sources that how important this is. The reason you're talking to me now is because you're upset, or you want somebody to know, like, how can I get this document? And I'm not encouraging anybody to put anybody's life or job at risk, but put the onus on them. Like, if you get this to me, I will protect your identity. And if it's a situation where, if we ran it, everybody would know it was you, we'll figure something out. But the first step is getting the information. Again, I'm not at all advocating any kind of illegal activity or to force somebody to do illegal activity. We don't do that. We're we do more than frown on that. But members of the public, and there's people in government, I mean, when you think of it, pardon me, the idea of FOIA is that taxpayers have a right to the information. And these people know it, and and these exemptions are just their crutches for the FOIA, for the agencies. They're not things.
So it sounds like if you know the information that you're looking for, there can be a variety of ways to get that information. You could use FOIA. You could look at using FOIA in another state if it's a interstate communication. You could work your sources. So there's a variety of ways. So that's not necessarily crafting the request. It's more like, if the goal is the information, how do you get to it? So, John, you had an incident or a situation just the other day where you were having some trouble getting information, and you went to favorable legislators to try and find information. So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I don't want to delve too long on circumventing FOIA, but tell us other ways that you've found to get information that you're looking for.
Well, that's kind of a lazy way of doing it, I guess. But let me just share with you, and I think I mentioned it yesterday about the Delaware City refinery. I was involved with a whole group of environmentalists, and in 2003, the Delaware City refinery is gone by so many different names, Motiva, Prentcore. Anyway, they were under a federal consent decree to reduce their air and water pollution. And through the reporting of Jeff Montgomery, who was an excellent reporter at the News Journal, we found out that the governor, then Governor Minner, was trying to cut the refinery a deal. She was going to eliminate the water pollution part of this consent decree. And we found out about it. We didn't know who had records about this deal. So we sent out 7 different FOIA requests to the 7 different agencies that were involved with this refinery. The governor's office, Secretary of Natural Resources was the second one, U.S. Justice Department and EPA in Washington, that's 4. The regional offices up in Philly, that's each one of those is 6, and the Delaware River Basin Commission. Now, a lot of them didn't respond. A few of them did not respond, but the personal contact, I think, helped with the governor's office. We had contacted the legal counsel for the governor, who was elected Attorney General years later, Matt Dehn, and he allowed us to come into the governor's office on the 10th or 11th floor to view the file.
We might be losing John for a second. I think what he's sharing is that they were allowed to see the documents. Is that correct, John?
Refinery project, and we found water pollution part of it. Yeah, he allowed us to come and review the case file on the refinery. Now, we appealed to various big shots here in Delaware who didn't want to handle this. It was too much of a hot potato. So we went down to DC, and we went to the New Jersey congressional delegation, Congressman Andrews, then Senator Corzine, and Senator Lautenberg's office. And lo and behold, the EPA director at the time was from New Jersey, Christy Whitman. So the thought of the state of Delaware capturing the pollution out of these smokestacks and then dumping the effluent into the river floating over New Jersey was enough to get the state to change their mind and reinstitute the full federal consent decree on pollution abatement at going in through the details. But we were trying to be as expansive as possible in one sense with FOIA, but also we did reach out personally to the governor's office, and we were able to identify that she was in fact cutting a deal with the refinery. And I not say how much I admired Matt Dehn for doing that, because it doesn't take a whole lot for these government bureaucrats to just reject your request and see if you go away after that. So my point is be as expansive as possible, 7 different requests, but also reach out to these different agencies if they could to urge them to fulfill the request also.
Sure. Okay. So going big, going around FOIA if necessary, and then knowing what you're trying to get after is sound to be the hallmarks of crafting the request. If you do need to go through FOIA, if you do want to FOIA a request, do you have a go-to handout? I know in the FOIA policy manual, there's a sample request in the back of it and whatnot. But as journalists, you're always asking for a fee waiver. You're always citing the law. Are there any specific tips that you all have if you're FOIAing something in terms of how you create that request? And I'll also open that up to all the wisdom in our room. If people have particular things they want to share that have been effective for them, I'm happy to hear it. But Phil,
Well,
anything in
Rebecca,
particular?
what
Go ahead,
I
John.
do is I go to Delaware.gov, and the very end of that Delaware.gov is a menu item of different resources, and FOIA is one of them. And if you click under FOIA, you'll see the different state agencies that you can make a request from electronically, and that's to me that's a real godsend. If you can make a electronic request in 20-25 minutes, that eliminates the letter getting lost in the mail with COVID and all the other restrictions that are going on. You could save yourself a good 3 or 4 days getting there, 3 or 4 days getting back. So that's what I do as a lobbyist activist, is file my request through the FOIA portal
And
for state
if we
aid.
can, just to clarify, because Delaware, of course, is a different state than some of our listeners have been used to working in. There's a central portal for all agencies in Delaware, and that's the Delaware.gov Information Act request. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, some of the municipalities have their own also. Again, like, search for it. Like, I mean, some of the smaller towns have them and some of the bigger ones don't,
Mhm.
you just have to sort of know and know who to make the request to. I mean, we have templates, FOIA templates where really what all the reporter needs to do is fill in what they're looking for, and the specifics of that. That helps a lot with if everybody had to write these from scratch. You say one word that, oh, well, we don't have to give it to you because you said that word, whatever. So
Right.
we try to keep it simple and basic and just make the request. But like John says, it's pretty rare even that the agencies abide by the 15-day. We got your request and we're going to do something with it. And whether it's the mail or vacation or, oh, I was off, it didn't get to me, sometimes that helps, but the thing is, being persistent is important. Like if they deny you and you just go away, and then they deny you the next time you go away, well, then they're never going to help you. Like
Mhm.
fighting them on everything, not everything. Like don't be a pest, but expressing that, look, I'm not after this to make your job miserable. We're not, the public has a right to know this stuff. There's nothing in the FOIA laws that say they can't get it. So how are you going to get it to me? How can I get this? How can we work together to tell the public what they're asking us for?
So just in terms of a timeline, say I'm a intrepid reporter, I file my request, someone doesn't get back to me within my 15-day period to let me know that they're on it. Do you follow up at that point? And then how often do you follow up? Because I know there's no real deadline, or I don't perceive that there's a real deadline in Delaware or any enforcement of when they're supposed to provide the information to you. But what do you recommend as follow-up, and how do you do that? Is it phone calls or emails?
If 15 days expires on the 16th day, the reporter usually sends an email to the person and says, hey, time's up. Give me an update. If they don't hear back or they get some Weasley answer, then we usually just shoot an email to the Attorney General's office and say, hey, here's what we asked for. Here's the date we asked for it. I tried to work through them. I can't get it from, and that usually will at least get a response from us. The harder issue is usually in those responses when they say, yes, we can do it. It's going to cost you $300. It'll take us as much. As soon as we get the check, we'll do it and we'll get it. A lot of times we get a timeline, then sometimes we don't. And that's when we just sort of have to stay on them and remind them, can you give us an estimate? And if they ghost us or the estimates aren't followed through, then we just sort of ping the Attorney General's office. And, we're not going to the Attorney General to get them to give it to us this second, but it's not unreasonable for them to give us like a week or a month that we might see it,
Got it.
I mean,
And So when you ping the Attorney General's office, you're not obviously not emailing Matt Dem, but who are you? Who are you? Is there a FOIA coordinator that's a go-to? Is there a central spot, or
Matt
what does that mean?
Matt Marshall's the PIO. He's one of the better PIOs in the state, at least acts like one of the better ones, and he takes that stuff seriously. He sends on it, and if he says, all right, we check with them, and but he at least follows through regularly. I don't know what John's experience is with that, but he's pretty responsive to us and pretty fair.
Great. So before we get into potential changes to the law, I want to just pause and ask if there are questions from the group. We've the chat's been pretty active. Oh, it looks like Emily is asking, some states have laws that only permit public information released to the residents of the state. That is terrific, because Delaware is a little bit different. I know in Maryland, if you ask, it doesn't really matter where you live, but in Delaware, it matters. So can you all speak a little bit about that?
In Delaware, technically, you're supposed to be a resident. Now, how do you define, a citizen? How do you define citizen? Well, citizen could be a company in the state of Washington that's registered here. They're considered a citizen. To me, it's ludicrous that if somebody writes to the state on, say, an environmental issue about air pollution going into Maryland or Pennsylvania, that their requests were to be denied. And it has happened on many occasions. And I've told a couple of these people, about 3 or 4, I say, well, if they won't give it to you, then I'll send it on your behalf. And I did that. And I did get the information from the various state agencies and sent it on to the one particular guy up in New York City. The state government should fulfill FOIA requests, period. They shouldn't hide behind this. You're not a citizen of the state of Delaware, and I'm not a citizen of Delaware. I'm a citizen of the United States, but that's what they'll hide behind. And so it's frustrating if you don't live here, but yet you're impacted by various activities here in the state of Delaware.
Well, the Mid-Atlantic is a close spot, so you could have people living in Philly or Maryland. So, Phil, with your newsroom kind of perhaps scattered, has it been a problem?
Well, it's funny because we have reporters who aren't residents or citizens of Delaware. They live in PA or Maryland, and they don't get denied because I guess they see they work for the News Journal. But then other times we'll have reporters for Freedom of the Press. I'll get an email say, I know some of them, Phil, hey, we're trying to get this, and they keep denying us because none of us live there. So we'll just submit it for them, like John says he does for people. It doesn't happen that much. I think there's some coordinators who don't even know that's a law. And like I said, if they were really following it, some of our reporters would get denied all the time because they live in Elkton or something like that, So
right.
It's weird. And it's one of those laws that I bet if we polled everybody in the legislature, they'd be like, yeah, that's stupid. But there's no way in hell we'd ever get them to change it.
Correct.
Just
because I do remember that's come up before, and we have been unable to make that happen.
It's the give a mouse a cookie thing, like if they change one thing, then they're opening the door that they're going to listen to other stuff. And that's not going to be sort of like the NRA's approach. So
are there any other questions that people have or things they want to contribute to the conversation before we move on? All right. Well, I feel like you're providing great information. People are soaking it up. And so let's go to our last topic before we go on, before we end, which are potential changes to the law. Now, Phil spoke briefly that, Delaware FOIA law has not changed substantially in some time. There's always been runs, or you had mentioned that, like they're not going to change the resident requirement and things like that. And it is tough to change FOIA law. But there are some changes that are on the governor's desk right now. And John, I think you were probably best suited to talk about that. You want to start us off with what changes are pending? And
sure. I think the big change this year was Paul Bombach's bill. Paul Bombach is the legislator from the city of Newark, and he put a bill in to guarantee the right of public to speak at public meetings. Now, prior to passage and signing of this law, the public had a right to monitor and observe the proceeding of their public bodies, but they did not have the right to speak unless that public body opened up the speaking to one or two other people. Then they could not deny you the right to speak. But most of the committee meetings that I go to in Dover, for example, they do honor the spirit of that. So I think it's going to apply more probably on the municipal level, the various towns and county governments in this state, where the public will have or should have a time to provide input about an issue or a concern that they may have. So I think that was the big thing to pass this year. The one thing that I think needs to be addressed is this issue about emails. I can, this whole thing about emails, they were excluded back in 2009 by then Majority Leader Schwarzkopf. It took 7 years for Senator Peterson to get a bill passed and signed into law to include the General Assembly under FOIA. Prior to that passage, I would go to the Joint Finance Committee meetings, and when they would caucus, they would kick you out of the meeting room. And now these meetings are open to the public. These meetings being the Joint Finance Committee, the Bond Bill, and the Grant and Aid Committee. So the next thing I would like to see is, and it's garnered a lot of concern in Dover when I bring it up, but the public documents, emails should be considered public documents and not exempted under the law that like they are now for the General Assembly.
Right. Well, and that's an issue where Delaware is behind the times. I mean, emails, the legislatures always want to shield their own things. They're quick to make laws that affect everyone else, but not necessarily themselves. But emails are certainly public records in this day and age. Phil, any things that you see pending as FOIA changes and grows?
Well,
potential changes?
The thing that worries me more, I mean, like I said, I don't ever expect it to get better here. But the thing I worry about is a year or so ago, we had, John knows of this too, I'm sure, and probably half the reporters on here. So I forget if she's Senator Gay, was going to introduce and extend the FOIA protections to family members of police officers, and what I worry about is, my God, our heads all explode when we hear that. And I think she was didn't have all the information when she proposed that. But the thing that I worry about, I'm not gonna speak for anybody else. The thing I worry about a lot is the legislature in Delaware, even though they're Democratic, mostly and liberal, like they're not very far left of center for the most part, other than some of the progressives here. And when it comes down to it, it's like, oh yeah, we can keep the public from seeing that. That's good. Let's do it. Just like we can't, like one of the biggest exemptions we deal with is we can't get legislators' emails. Well, why? Because they don't want us to see what they want, not because they understand why we want them,
Right.
It's, and that's why we're it. I remember Jack Markell became governor. When he first became governor, we had meetings with him, and he was very much, I'm going to fix this FOIA thing, or I'm going to take steps to fix it. And he, I don't know, I'm just going to call it an edict, but he said he standardized how much, because at that part, like if we FOIA the Department of Labor or Department of Health, we would get different estimates for the same thing. Like it would cost 10 cents for a copy at one place and $1 a page in another place. And he tried to standardize that, and it was a good attempt. But then after about 6 months or a year of us writing stories, I guess he got a lot and it went away, and it's back to where it was. He's like, oh, geez. I think he realized, oh, well, when the public can see what we're doing, I don't like that.
It can be painful. Transparency is great for everybody else. We've had two questions kind of come in over the transmit the last minute. So in our remaining 2 minutes, let's see if we can answer those. One is, are the governor's emails considered public documents, or are they exempted?
So this is an excellent question, and they are, but we are still fighting. We had FOIA'd for emails between the governor and a private citizen of Delaware, and it was denied under an exemption, or it was denied saying that it was personal communications from his, .gov account, and that was protected, and they didn't have to share it. We think it's bullshit. We're trying to fight it. Sorry for the French. I don't think it, John. I mean, we're all on the side of, you got to be kidding me. Like it's a person in Delaware. Well, but for the most part, they are. Now, speaking of Jack Markell, we would FOIA his emails a lot, and we found out about 5 or 6 years into his term that he had created 2 or 3 other email accounts where he was doing business. They were on the .gov server, but they were, so we would ask for, emails from this account. We didn't know the other ones existed, right? So,
yeah, and that happens, especially with the proliferation of communication devices. Like Maryland had the Wicker scandal, where the governor was using instant messaging.
Well, that's what happened with Hillary, and that's the November or the late October surprise in that race was she used her personal email. But the governor's emails, for the most part, we should, the public has access to.
Okay.
Now there's some they can hide behind FOIAs of it, but
there's always overused exemptions. And then finally, what if any penalties result from a FOIA violation? I mean, there are no criminal charges. I think sometimes they're laughable, penalties, because they just don't get implemented. But what are there penalties? Are there meaningful penalties?
John's been here longer than me. I have never heard of anybody getting even the slightest reprimand for doing this wrong. I mean, the
most you can get. I was just going to say the most you can get is personal satisfaction from being vindicated. But yeah, there really is no meaningful penalties for these things. And Rebecca, let me just mention one thing. There was a bill that Senator Gay, Phil mentioned Senator Gay, she put a bill in, and she had drafted this with the Attorney General's office, greatly expanding the ability or the right of state agencies to declare FOIA requests as frivolous.
Correct. That was huge and extremely damaging. Now that died in the last session.
It did. I mean, we asked the Attorney General's office to provide us, of the 666 opinions they wrote since 1995, share with us the ones that were responded to as frivolous requests, and we got nothing back. So that would have been really damaging if that bill passed.
We had heard that there's a very few people who file like a FOIA request a day, members of the public, and they got tired of having to respond to them, and their response was, instead of setting up a meeting or talking to this person and saying, it was just draft legislation that would cripple what little access we have to stuff now. So
correct. Yeah, put all the cards in the hands of state agencies to say, oh, that's a frivolous request and you're blackballed from making any more. So we are out of time, but this has been such a great conversation. I hope that it's been a good overview for everyone on what FOIA is in Delaware and some ways that you can use it in your reporting and your work, and and some of the pitfalls when you file requests. Chris has been really helpful in putting our registration for our second session, which is December 6th, also at noon, where we will talk about what to do when your FOIA request is denied. So that'll be particularly helpful, but definitely keep the conversation going. We will have this session, the recording of this session, on the MDDC YouTube channel, and Sam will put the links of some of what was in the chat in that video. And I appreciate, John, both you and Phil, for coming out today and sharing your expertise and wisdom. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yep.
Great. And everyone have